Hi, everyone. Welcome to using the force field analysis to optimize the critical path of any process. Rolls right off the tongue. My name is Amy Manning, and I have been in customer success for over a decade now. And this is a framework I have gone back to time and time again to improve processes, to make decisions, to change customer behaviors. It can be used in a myriad of ways, and I'm excited to walk you through it today. So let's just jump right in there. So you're probably thinking, what is a force field analysis? Sounds cool. I like the force. I love Baby Yoda, but how is this going to help me in my work? So let me give you a little bit of a framework, a basis to understand, and then we'll jump into the actual how you do it. So force field analysis was developed by a man named Lewin. He's often recognized as the founder of social psychology. And I think a great way to illustrate what a force field analysis is just to do a little science experiment. So bear with me. I promise this is relevant. So you'll need to be sitting down, which you probably are, so that'll work. And I want you to think about what's keeping you in your chair. There are two things really. There's two answers. One is gravity, which is pushing you down into the chair. That's a driving force, if you like. And the other is the chair itself, which provides an opposing force, and it's pushing against gravity and thankfully stopping you from falling to the ground. So sitting in the chair is an equilibrium of sorts. You have two forces working together to keep you there. Gravity is pushing you down, keeping you in the chair. The chair is resisting this and stops you from falling to the ground. So two equal forces, a driving force and a resisting force or a restraining force, working to keep the status quo. So let's keep going here. We're going to play a little bit more. So let's say we want to move away from the status quo or the equilibrium. We want to fall on the floor. What do we do? On the one hand, we could increase the amount of gravity, that driving force. The chair would eventually give way and you would fall. Or on the other hand, we could let gravity do its thing and decide to weaken the chair or remove the chair, our restraining force, and we would get to the same result. You're on the floor. So if you've followed me this far, you have basically just completed a force field analysis and you have understood the basic concepts of the model. This scientific experiment is relevant because this is what we're going to be talking about today, but in the lens of business processes. And Kurt Lewin applied this exact methodology to social situations, to change people and processes alike. And we can use it too. All right, so you can see there's a little graphic here, and I'm going to speak kind of theoretically, in theory. So I'm going to walk through the process both at a theoretical level, but then I also want to kind of take it down to something more actionable and talk about a specific time when I used this framework and how it helped me specifically in my job in customer success. So the first step is you need to define your vision or your goal. And it's really helpful if you have a whiteboard or something you can write on. You want to draw literally a rectangle. And in the middle of that rectangle, you want to articulate what your goal is. And so for me specifically, when I started at LawGeex about 3 years ago, we were an early stage startup with, maybe 80 customers, and half of them were stuck in onboarding. The average number of days in the onboarding phase was about 140. So my job as the VP of customer success is to ensure that customers are finding value in the technology. How could they possibly be finding value if they're still in onboarding? Because they can't even use the technology. So that to me was like the biggest, need was to figure out how do we reduce this onboarding time from about 140 days to a goal that was kind of pulled out of thin air, but it sounded like a good goal, which was 30 days. And so this force field analysis really helped me do that. So I set my goal, I wrote it in my rectangle of reducing onboarding time to 30 days. And then I needed to take it a step further and really understand the onboarding process. And you don't always have to do this in a force field analysis. If you understand the process deeply that you're trying to impact or the situation that you're trying to impact, you don't necessarily need to take this extra step. But for me, I was new in the role, and so I needed to deeply understand the status quo. And so I mapped out the workflow. And I want to talk through that a little bit just because I think that we often find ourselves in this situation where you're starting a new role and you're like, okay, I need to get my arms around all of these processes, or you have processes that maybe you're getting involved in or you're coming in to optimize. And so you really need to start to deeply understand these processes. So the way that I have found is best for me as a visual person to map out a particular workflow is to literally map it out. So I use a tool called Miro. It's amazing. It's free and it's like a one-click sign up, and you can use templates or build something yourself and literally think through the entire journey that you're trying to impact. So in this case, it was the onboarding journey, but it can be any journey. And so you want to think about what are internal actions, and those are colored in one color, versus external actions, and those are going to be colored in another color. Also highlighting possible pain points, both again, internally and externally. Calling out points for discussion, I think is really interesting too. And, noting who those internal stakeholders are. You can see there's little colored dots on each box. Those indicate the different stakeholders, because it may be that it's not the customer success team that's doing something, it's the product team, or it's an onboarding team, or it's a technical account management team. So mapping out not just the actions that need to be taken, but who actually owns those actions. And then also potentially mapping out sub-processes. Within a big process like onboarding, there's oftentimes lots of like little workflows that happen. And so it might make sense to map those out as well. So again, this is not typically part of the force field framework, but I think it's an important step if you're trying to really deeply understand a process, especially one that you might be new to. Okay, so let's get back to our force field. So the next step we have to take is identify those driving forces. So I'm going to keep going back to our chair experiment. The driving force was gravity. So what are the things that push things forward, basically? And this was an exercise where literally me and the customer success team got in a room, again, with a whiteboard, but you could totally do this virtually, and we brainstormed. What are the forces that help us in our onboarding journey? What are the things that we see that when we have them, they actually move things forward? We had a much longer list than 3, but a couple of examples that we found were things like executive involvement. When the executive was involved, that really helped push onboarding because we could get the customer to do what we needed them to do faster, because there was the executive, the person who just signed the deal was like, I want to get this done. working with what we defined as a policy setter. So this was a specific role, a type of person that we found was really helpful. So understanding that helped us think about, okay, well, how do we make sure we know who that policy setter is? We realized that when customers have a baseline that they're starting with, that also really helps us because it kind of gives us a leg up. So there were, dozens of things that we brainstormed and thought about. What are the things that when we have them, they can help drive things forward? And they can be emotional things, they can be people, they can be processes, they can be documents. It's really like anything goes. It's a brainstorming exercise. There are no bad ideas, basically. Then we focus on the other side. What are the restraining forces? And again, same thing. We're whiteboarding this out, we're writing them all down. We had way more than 3. And again, they don't have to be deliverables or concrete steps. They can be feelings. That's a huge restraining force in customer adoption, are people's fears. For us specifically at LawGeex, it's fear of being replaced. We work with lawyers, that's our point of contact, and they're worried that our technology is going to replace them. And that is absolutely something that is a blocker towards that goal of onboarding. Setting up a playbook, which for us is a very detailed kind of, we're codifying your legal policy, getting samples of different contracts. So there were all kinds of things where we identified, these tend to be a restraining force, meaning they're holding us back within the process. They're either adding time or adding hurdles or can stop the process altogether. And this was really interesting. None of the team had ever done an exercise like this before. We took hours, and I think the thought exercise in and of itself is really interesting. It gets people talking about things in a different way, seeing their customers in a different way. You get a million different ideas, and it's really easy to come away from a meeting like this with like, oh, we're going to do these 10 things, and oh, we're going to do these other things, and oh, we're going to pull product in, and we're going to get this, and we're going to get that. And there's like a million things you could do. And so that's why this next step is super duper important. And this is where you actually start to score the different forces, because not all driving forces or opposing forces are of equal strength. If we go back to our chair experiment, is it easier to increase gravity or remove the chair? I have no idea how you'd increase gravity, but I can definitely pull a chair out. So, the outcome would be the same. You're still on the floor, but the level of effort is completely different. And so thinking about and rating both of the driving forces and the opposing forces, typically people use a 5-point scale, where 5 represents the strongest, and obviously 1 is the lowest. You can use a 10-point scale if it's like a really big process and there's a lot of things, but I tend to just try to keep it simple, because 10 points is like, that's a lot of numbers you got to decide between. And then when you've got some things that are a 6 and a 7, like, I think keeping it to 1 to 5 just keeps it simple. And so you go through and you start rating these different driving forces and opposing forces on their strength. And what that means is you are rating them on their ability to impact change. So if we had this consistently, how impactful would that be? How much change would that drive? Or if we didn't have this thing, consistently, how impactful would that be? After doing this a bunch of times, I can definitely say that I have found that generally removing the opposing forces tends to be more impactful than amping up the driving forces, because you're removing literal blockers. But it's still an important exercise to do for both sides, and then start to winnow it down and figure out, okay, what do we really want to do here? What is going to drive the biggest impact? And that then can help you kind of get down to an action plan. So in your action plan, you're looking at the impact. And then I think it's also important to start thinking about effort too. If something is going to be a massive amount of effort, maybe hold off on it, or maybe there's some, minimum viable product version that you can do. Just being realistic, when we winnow it down to a couple of specific things, I kind of think in my mind of, effort and impact. What do I want to do first? And, those things that are going to have the biggest effort, or excuse me, the biggest impact, but take less effort, those are obviously your low-hanging fruit. So you review your forces, you decide which forces have the biggest impact and the lowest effort, and also have flexibility to change and can be influenced. Some things like fear of someone losing their job, how much can you influence that? It's debatable. Then you start to strategize and create a plan to help you strengthen those driving forces and weaken or remove. That's the other thing, is sometimes I think people get stuck in this mode of thinking where they're like, well, we can't remove this thing. I can't remove somebody's fear, let's say, but there might be ways to reduce it. Maybe working with the executive buyer and making sure the executive buyer is communicating to his team all the great things that they're going to be able to do once they don't have to look at these stupid contracts anymore. That can help to reduce or weaken the fear. You might not be able to remove it completely, but you can remove some of the power of those forces. And then, of course, you want to start prioritizing. What are the things that are going to have the biggest impact? What are the resources that you're going to need? Are you going to have to go to another team? Are you going to have to go to your product team or your engineering team or an account management team and ask them for help in doing these things? So, it's also important to think about the resources of those other teams and what they might be able to give you. So to kind of pull it all together here, and I know I'm going through this very quickly, you want to identify your objective, you want to map your driving forces, then you want to map your restraining forces. I think it's helpful if you can to do those in the same session, because people kind of get into the groove, they understand what you're doing, and then you can really get those brainstorming juices flowing. Rate all those forces, and then work on your action plan through the lens of both impact and effort, as well as the resources that you have available. And, I know this process might sound like a lot of work, but truly it can be done in a day. If everyone can get together and have that meeting, and then you can come away from it with a plan of action that you feel really confident is going to get to the goal. And you're able to go to your executive team or your CEO or whoever it is and say, okay, we've done a force field analysis. Our goal is X, and here are the specific projects that we're going to do to get to that goal. And then you can measure the impact of those projects as you do them, and really show not just correlation, but causation, and say, this is what I did, and this was the impact that it had on that really specific goal. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different types of processes where you can use a force field analysis. There are many, both in personal and professional life. This framework is helpful in a lot of areas. A few specific ones where I've used it before, improving a processes like onboarding, which we just talked about. Removing barriers to adoption. This is a super valuable framework for something like that. If you're trying to drive people to log in more, engage with the product more, download more things, upload more things, whatever your product is, looking through the lens of adoption, through this framework, you can really identify both physical and psychological barriers to adoption and start to try to adjust or remove some of those. This is also a really interesting framework for managing product feedback. Obviously in customer success, we get product feedback all the time from our customers. And, instead of just submitting that into kind of the black box of the product team and just waiting to see what they prioritize, you can actually think about this through the lens of what's important to the business. If it's important to drive greater adoption, if it's important to, get people to reduce their time to value, if it's important to whatever it is that's important to you as a CS team and as a business, thinking about the product feedback through that lens and using that force field analysis can help you prioritize what's important to act on with the product feedback. Making changes or difficult decisions, it can be a little bit like doing a SWOT analysis too. If you're struggling with a particular decision and whether it's the right thing to do or not, looking at the different forces can help you decide what's important to you. Resolving a team issue. This can be also a great way to help a team focus on the bigger goals versus themselves or what's important to them. And then I love this one too, assisting the sales organization in closing deals faster. If your vision or your goal is close deals faster, what are the things that help accelerate deals and what are the things that restrain deals? And working through that together can also be a really valuable exercise. So really, I challenge all of you to think about what areas of both your professional and your personal life do you want to improve, and how could a force field analysis help in that? Okay, so I see we've got some questions here. So let me jump in. All right, so I've got a question here. How do you manage having team members that are consistently wanting to improve processes but won't give enough time to let new things ride? Ooh, that's interesting. I don't want to stifle creativity, but there are a lot of cooks trying to be in the kitchen. That is a tough one. I feel like there's two things here. There's one is actually giving things enough time to see if they have an impact. And then the other is a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So I'm gonna address them separately. I think, if you can identify the specific projects that you want to focus on from this analysis, then, and I found this in my own teams, it allows you to assign ownership of the different projects. So you might say, okay, as a group, we've identified these projects, but we're not going to execute on them as a group. This person's going to own that project, and this person's going to be owner of that project. And they can pull in other people to assist and to help in different ways, but that person on the team is the owner, and they are responsible for driving it forward and also for measuring the impact. So I think I have found personally that can help when there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, is to just designate for a particular project, you're the owner, it's your responsibility to take this forward, and you can pull in whatever resources you want, but you own it. And then, if people don't want to give enough time to let it ride, I think you have to agree beforehand, how much time do we want to take this? Do we want to do this for 3 months and see the impact? Do we want to do it for 1 month, depending on what it is, and just keep keep measuring, and also help your team understand that, like, there isn't necessarily like the one silver bullet. If you just did that one thing, everything would be fixed. Because if there was, you would have done it already. It's incremental. There's lots of little changes that are going to incrementally help make things better. And so just really helping your team understand that all these little incremental goals lead to a massive change, and that it's not necessarily going to be, one big thing. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions here. How can we use this to climb the ladder from user discussions to a more strategic discussion with a VP or higher? Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if you mean like internally or externally with customers, so maybe I'm going to put a pin in that for the moment, and feel free to like add more comments so that I can understand the question a little bit better. So someone asked, is there a recommended time frame for completing steps 1 through 5? I'm thinking about avoiding analysis paralysis. Totally. Any tips on knowing when you have enough info to take action? So super great question and comment. I agree. It can be easy to get into this mode of like, for weeks we're thinking about these things and we're mulling over them and not actually taking any action. The whole framework of steps 1 through 5 literally could be done in a day or two. You can decide what your goal is, meet, brainstorm, come up with your forces, rate them, and then, from that, decide on a couple of projects, maybe like give it a day to marinate on, make sure you're happy with them tomorrow, and then assign them to different team members and get going. Like you really don't need to mull over it for a long time, because it's really about figuring out what are the things that are going to drive change, and then do them. So we've got another question here. What if you don't have a CS team and you're new in the role? How can you know which forces to focus on? That's an interesting question. I mean, it sounds to me like you're kind of resourceless. It's just you. I think in that case, I might focus on the forces that are cross-functional and go to some of those, cross-functional leaders and say, I really need your help in impacting this. How can you help me with resources? Can I have X number of time, or can this person on your team actually work on this with me? A lot of times I find that functional, leaders, managers of different teams, they're looking for ways to get team members involved in other things that will be exciting for them, and they can see it as kind of a visibility project. So if you can go to the product, VP of product and say, hey, can I work with one of your product managers on this specific thing that's going to improve this really important process? I think this would be a great visibility project and an awesome kind of cross-functional collaboration story. I feel like they're going to say yes. I think most people would have a hard time saying no to that. Okay, let's see. Was the workflow software called Miro? No, it's called Miro with an M. M-I-R-O. Okay, for the opposing forces, we're assigning its strength to slow down or stop the process. Correct. Yes, that's exactly right. So you're assigning its strength is how strong is it in slowing down or stopping you from getting to your goal. So if, going back to our example, I'm gonna use my slides here. Those opposing forces, we found that the playbook setup was a big opposing force. Like getting a playbook set up, codifying the legal policy was the thing that really slowed things down for us. And so that got a 4, maybe even a 5, I don't remember. And so, you're giving it that point scale is on how strong it is at stopping something, basically. All right, there's a lot of questions here, but I think we are out of time. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and I really hope that this, was something inspiring and useful. And if you want to find me on LinkedIn, feel free, hit me up if you want to, ask questions about force field analysis. I am a total process nerd, so I am happy to talk about it. And yeah, thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it.